Okay, section 3, how to work with ayahuasca. I know the course has been kind of long. You've gone through a lot of modules. I've hoped that you've kind of spread this throughout a few days. I would humbly suggest that this module and the following one are some of the most important. What I'm about to say is a compilation of a lot of very hard-earned wisdom from a lot of experience with ayahuasca, hundreds and hundreds of ceremonies. My own, Tete Fernando's, Sam's, previous staff at LaWayra, and the thousands of people who have come through here that we as facilitators have learned from. I offer it to you guys in hope that it will help you commune with ayahuasca smoothly and with confidence. So to start this section, how to work with ayahuasca, I want to just preface it by talking about my focus being more with how instead of what. At LaWayra, we intentionally try to be very hands-off on making explicit statements about what ayahuasca is. Even if we use the same words, every single one of us is going to have our own idea of what ayahuasca is and how it works. We feel that it's really important for you to go through your own discovery process rather than simply taking on ours. There's a big difference between those two things. And secondly, we also feel that it doesn't really get at the heart of the matter. I like to think of it as imagining if I and two of my coworkers were walking towards a stream. Sam is Latvian, and the Latvian word for water is udens. And so we're walking towards a stream, and he says, "Oh man, I'm so excited to jump into the udens." And I say, "Udens, what are you talking about? I want to get into the water." And my coworker Nico, who's Colombian, says, "Water? I'm getting in the agua." We're quibbling over these words, but these are just concepts that we've layered over the fundamental reality of this thing. And those words can never touch what that is or the experience of jumping into the lake. So there's reality, there's what is happening, and then there are the innumerable ways that we try to explain or articulate that thing. One person might say that ayahuasca is a spirit descending from the cosmos, coming down to touch us and connect us to our natural essence of stardust. Another person might say ayahuasca is just a DMT molecule that passes through the blood-brain barrier, inducing a therapeutic mental state in the mind. Two pretty different explanations, but they're describing the exact same thing. So for me personally, I'm a lot more interested in trying to get at what that thing is, how this thing is working, what the reality of its function is, rather than quibbling on or trying to convince someone of what I think it is. It's really important, in our opinion, that we be hands-off and allow you to think whatever you want. These explanations ultimately are what in Zen we call fingers pointing at the moon. They are helpful for directing us towards something, but none of them capture the moon itself. And it's very important to not get attached to the finger, mistaking it for the moon. So, essentially what I'm getting at is it is not the way we think about or explain ayahuasca that impacts how we work with it, but rather how we relate to it. There are no requisite beliefs, like I need to think about ayahuasca this way, I need to believe in it like Tinkerbell. There's no spiritual prerequisites, like I need to have done this or that to be able to work with it. And there is no correct belief, in my opinion, that means you've got an ayahuasca figured out. In my opinion, ayahuasca is beyond the human mind's capacity to conceptualize. Rather, this work is a way of being rather than a way of thinking. So, what I'll be directed towards in this section are some of these core ways of being, and I will use some language that might not resonate with you, but I use it more as an expedient to point towards this underlying thing. I want to start about the 3 psychedelic S's. Most people have heard of the first and second common psychedelic S's. Those are set and setting. These are taken to be 2 of the fundamental elements that impact how your experience with a certain plant medicine will be. So setting is the physical environment that you're within. So taking ayahuasca within this maloca is going to be a different experience than taking it under a bridge. It's going to impact your experience. Set is pretty much your internal makeup. That includes your local emotional state, how you've been doing recently in the past few days, weeks, months, even years. And it's also kind of personality elements, such as your personality structure, how you are as a person, and also the beliefs that you use to organize your existence in the world. So oftentimes within this concept of set, someone who is a Christian will probably have a more Christian-influenced psychedelic experience than someone who is a Hindu. These medicines tend to communicate with us through the language of our subconscious. So those are set and setting, and a lot of people have heard of that. In my opinion, there's a third S that needs to be considered in determining our experience with a plant medicine. This third S is skills. A way of being, a way of relating to these medicines takes practice. It is an art. I believe, particularly with ayahuasca, this art takes continual work, reflection, adjustment. to develop the skills needed to do this work beautifully and harmoniously in the way that you need to take time to dance beautifully. In my view, throughout your time here and going forward, if you continue to work with ayahuasca, you are always going to be in a process of learning how to work with the medicine, developing the skills you have for meeting the medicine halfway in this work. Ayahuasca does not just give you everything. As I said, we have to meet it halfway. And so to work with ayahuasca, to learn from it, to heal and grow, is a learning process that requires ongoing engagement, adjustments, reflection, and practice. What I would like to accomplish with this next section is simply planting seeds. Always, as you go through your work with ayahuasca, you're going to need to explore all of these concepts yourself. You get the gift of exploring these things by yourself. You might find that something I said actually really resonates, or you really disagree with another thing. But usually we find that these signposts are helpful for expediting this learning process as people get into the experience of ayahuasca. The most important thing, I think, in going into this process is understanding patience is a necessary element of learning any new skill, including working with ayahuasca. If you expect to just come to retreat and automatically have mastered all of this and be able to do everything perfect and get everything you ever wanted from ayahuasca, that's not a very realistic understanding of how all of this works. And so I think it's better to be compassionate with yourself and allow yourself to go through the learning process required. I like to give an analogy of if I was trying to learn how to paint and I got myself an easel, I got myself a palette, I sat down, I painted for about 3 hours, I stood back, looked at my painting, and immediately got super mad, like, this isn't the fucking Mona Lisa, what bullshit. That wouldn't be a very realistic understanding of what practice is required and what patience through that practice is required to learn how to actually do this art I'm working with. So before we jump into the specifics, I just want to make another point of emphasis on patience with yourself and realism and how this process might unfold. It is hard to be confused and new at something. And oftentimes we want to blame it on external sources for why something isn't going right. Really, it's best to not get angry, impatient, or frustrated. And it's definitely best to not delude ourselves into thinking that we've already mastered everything. What we need to do is honestly and humbly find our starting point, where we are in the spectrum of working with this medicine, and then simply work from there, making adjustments, shifting back and forth around an ever-evasive center line. In my mind, it's all but impossible to not heal and grow from this medicine if we adopt a mindset of patient, endless practice. That said, it can be really challenging to adopt that mentality, so it's good to focus on it as a guiding light for how we go through this work. So, with these two precursors, number one, my focus is not on what or why ayahuasca is, but on how it works and what we can do to best relate to it. And number two, understanding that all of these are skills that we're going to need to be learning and honing over time. I'm going to offer 5 specific skills that I think are really helpful guides for the way of being or the way of relating to ayahuasca, what ayahuasca asks of us in our work with it. The first skill is an overarching one that encompasses all of the other 4, and that is flow. There are a bunch of words I think that we can use to try and get at this thing I'm talking about: balance, flexibility, responsiveness, harmonizing. All of those are pointing towards this thing, but I think flow captures it really well. I've seen that flow, just a fluidity to how we are, is one of the most central elements of connecting with the medicine. I came across a Bible passage a while ago, and I'm not a Bible guy, but I would like to read it because I think it captures an idea of what this concept of flow is getting at. It's Ecclesiastes 3:1-9. To everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck of that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What I love about this passage is it shows that reality requires of us a responsiveness rather than one prescription that we can follow dogmatically to get us through everything. I can't just sit here and give you a list of 10 things that if you do these things exactly, then you're going to be acing ayahuasca and it's going to be perfect. There's no real way of doing ayahuasca right, because ayahuasca is constantly shifting, constantly working in different ways, that we need to be flowing and being responsive to this experience. And that's actually quite challenging because flow can feel like one thing but be another thing. What I'm giving are essentially general guidelines that help guide most people in a productive direction when working with ayahuasca. But always, you're going to need to find your own way along this path. The following skills should not be thought of as simple rules to follow, but rather states of being that can be expressed in many different ways. Every piece of advice I give you, we can find a counterpoint that will point towards a different thing that one person might need to do in ceremony. At one moment, you might need to sit still, and later, you should dance. In one moment, you might need to really let yourself feel this deepest feeling you can. And then another moment, you might need to choose to let go of that feeling and release it to be replaced by something new. This is the flow, the fluidity, the non-prescriptiveness that ayahuasca asks of us. It's kind of trite how cliche it is, but I think thinking about water is a great way of thinking about flow. There's a little droplet of water and it's going down a stream, but it hits a rock. It doesn't just stop there and be like, well, I was flowing down the stream. Why is this rock here? This is bullshit. It just goes around it and keeps going. Then it reaches a lake, and the lake is baking in the sun and it gets hot. The water doesn't just complain about being hot. It vaporizes and goes up into the air, where later it gets cold and condenses and rains back down. It is just flowing with reality as it comes. Ayahuasca wants us to learn that, both to work with it and to exist within reality. So because ayahuasca could be such a contradictory, shifting thing, I think within flow, it's very important to have the capacity and flexibility to hold these paradoxes of when you should be doing one thing once and another and the opposite thing at another moment. Recruiting different skills at different times to always adjust around this ever-shifting equilibrium we call balance. Really, like it sounds so simple, but when you're in ceremony, you find just how difficult it is. Working with ayahuasca is complex. And the best way to navigate this complexity is not by controlling, not by being dogmatic or prescriptive or trying to do something. It's really just relaxing, listening to yourself, trusting us, and flowing with the experience that unfolds. So that's number one, and that's the overarching quality. Letting go of control, relaxing, and flowing, carrying that into all the following four I'm going to give. The following skills underneath this umbrella of flow are surrender, trust, opening, and listening. And with each of these, I'll give an analogy to try and help communicate what I'm talking about. Okay, so number one, trust. Some of you may have heard ayahuasca referred to as the grandmother spirit before. Again, I'm not very interested in whether or not this is a spirit or whatever, but I do think that that is a helpful heuristic for understanding how ayahuasca works. Ayahuasca does have a sort of grandmotherly-like function to it. What that requires for ayahuasca to function as a grandmother, that inherently puts us relationally as a grandchild. And so what we can do in this equation is try to take on a sort of childlike mindset relating to a grandmother. When I say grandmother spirit, I just want to remind people that what I'm trying to get at is the function of ayahuasca. People find that it works in the way their grandmother might. But it's important to not mistake that finger for the moon. I've worked with a lot of people that hear grandmother spirit, and I think they create some sort of mental phantom in their head that they're chasing throughout the retreat. It's really hard to catch yourself doing this, but it does happen. Some people hear this and they expect some kind of Mary Poppins, Tinkerbell-like element to descend down, wrap them up in their grandmotherly skirts and swaddle them in love. Also, people tend to dichotomize themselves from the medicine. There's the medicine or grandmother ayahuasca over here, and there's the I or the me over here. Oftentimes, ayahuasca is really kind of a mirror that is showing us ourself in confusing and surprising ways. Ayahuasca mirrors how a benevolent grandmother would care for a child. As such, the child trusts the grandmother's wisdom. Imagine a kid who has had 4 cookies, and they're with their grandma, and they're like, "Grandma, I know I had 4 cookies, but I really think a 5th cookie would be pretty awesome right now." And the grandmother's like, "No, last week you had 5 cookies and you puked, so I think it's going to be better for you that you only have 4 cookies." The grandchild might start throwing a tantrum and freaking out and saying that the grandmother's so mean and why doesn't she love him and why won't she give him what he wants? But if the grandchild is able to step back and embody this sort of trust I'm talking about, they can say, oh, my grandmother has lived 10 times my lifespan, and I trust the decision she's making, and trust that it's coming from an informed, caring position that I might not be able to access. So I'm not recommending for you to wait for some grandmother to arrive, but rather try to take that position of the grandchild, trusting the entire process. Again, it does not matter if you believe in spirits or whatever. This is something I've come to believe in just by watching every person's experience unfold over the amount of time they've come to LaWayra for. This is the descriptor I could give for the function of ayahuasca that we see over and over and over again, regardless of how you think about what it is, spirit or molecule or both. But we do need to understand the breadth of this grandmother's compassion. Compassion can be soft and caring, like swaddling the child in a hug and giving bunches of kisses. But compassion can also be harsh and cutting. It can be denying the cookie and telling them to go to bed so they're rested for the day tomorrow. And it's also impossible for the grandchild to understand why the grandmother does what she does. So in the end, really, just trust that the process is unfolding as it should. A central tagline for trust is you don't get what you want, you get what you need. I'll say that again. You don't get what you want, you get what you need. This is how ayahuasca functions. And so if we can trust in that, we're going to save ourselves a lot of the energy of fighting against this grandmother-like energy. Trust, of course, develops over experience. You're going to have to come into trusting the medicine yourself. But do try and keep it in mind as a guiding light as you go through your experiences. I also just want to note quickly before moving on that the capacity to trust is also a skill. It's something that's learned. My grandmother was an incredible woman, but she also kind of scared me when I was a kid. I don't feel as if I really learned those skills of releasing myself to the wisdom of someone much older than me in the way that others did. And I actually had a ceremony in which I received a very gentle vision as I was trying to trust ayahuasca, of sitting at my grandmother's table and feeling frightened. And in that moment, I realized that my capacity to trust ayahuasca was not developed strongly as a child. And a lot of people that come through LaWayra have had similar experiences. And so there's learning to trust ayahuasca, and then there's also learning to be able to trust. And all of that is wrapped up in both what ayahuasca is asking from you and what it wants you to learn. So that's number one within this umbrella of flow, trust. Number two is surrender. I've developed a personal philosophy while working here that is, all of us are born with a fundamental softness, a core of vulnerability and love. But as we progress through our life, we are injured and we get wounds, and our egoic structure develops complex defense mechanisms to protect us from further harm. It may be getting angry so that people stay away from you and don't further hurt you. It may be turning off your emotions so you don't have to keep dealing with these difficult things. When those defense mechanisms develop, they are actually essential and kind of wonderful adaptations that keep us alive and keep us sane in that moment. However, the issue is that they have a stickiness where they stay around our psychology longer than when they're useful and kind of haunt us even decades later. They can be profoundly difficult to release, particularly also because sometimes we can identify with and become rewarded for those defense mechanisms. So for me, I grew up feeling like I needed to be perfect because on some deep level, I felt as if I was worthless and everyone was going to find out if I didn't do everything perfectly. As I went through school, that perfectionism got me really good grades and made me really successful in my classes. And so I got a lot of rewards for it. And I ended up identifying with being the perfect student. Whereas really that perfectionism was a way of protecting myself from an insecurity of not having inherent self-worth. So going through that web and releasing them can be really challenging. We are lucky that ayahuasca is trying to help us in moving through that process of identifying what is trying to protect and therefore keep us apart from that soft core and help us release it. But because those defense mechanisms for so long have felt like the things that are protecting us, we can fight this process. One of the analogies we like to use at LaWayra is working with ayahuasca can be a little bit like putting a cat into our bath if our ego was the cat. This structure that tries to keep us safe, that thinks it's taking care of us, can really resist what is ultimately going to be good for us. A story that I think communicates this well in hyperbole is the story of a patient that we had a few months ago who in ceremony was starting to kind of thrash around and make noises. When that happens, one of us tends to go over and be near them in case they need any help. And so I was standing there with my necklace, jingling my beads, so he knew I was there. And then all of a sudden he shot upright, took off his eye mask and was like, Mark. I was like, what's up, man? How's it going? He's like, dude, like I am feeling the most love I have ever felt in the entire world. And I wish everyone in existence could feel this. I was like, that's awesome, dude. I'm so happy for you. Like another person having this experience that we wish everyone could have. So I started to walk away. He seemed okay. He's like, wait, Mark, one thing before you go. I'm like, what is it? Tell me. It's like, I really want to be closer to the medicine. I just need to be close, but I don't know if it's okay to ask to be closer. I was like, of course, man, let's do it. Come on over. And so he gets over. I'm like, you want your mattress with you? He's like, yeah, bring the mattress. So I pick up the mattress. We walk over. I sit him down front and center. He's like, no, I want to be against the wall so that I can kind of rest against it. I was like, cool, let's do that. Bring him over, get him all set up, leave him there, happy as a duck. I go about my work and then check in on him in 10 minutes and just look over. And he's like, you can almost see the steam coming out of his ears, just fuming. Like, that's different. So I go over and he is really angry at me. He's like, I do not understand why you put me here. I was being totally good, very respectful over there. I was not disrupting anyone. You can ask them. And I should not be in timeout right now. It was pretty wild for me. Of course, I hope at home you've realized what happened. He asked to be over there. And then all of a sudden, a few minutes later, he was furious at me because he thought that I had put him in timeout. This patient, a couple of days earlier, was sharing in Word Circle about his relationship with his father and how his dad had left him for about 6 years when he was a kid. And then he all of a sudden came back to the family, got back with his mother, but then was pretty abusive and a real disciplinarian towards that kid. And one of the things he wanted to work on was his relationship or that sort of imprint that his father had left in him as he moved through the world as an adult. My perspective of what happened is while he was on the mattress, the medicine went straight through all of his defense mechanisms and connected him to that soft, loving core that I'm talking about. But when we connect with that core, we also have to confront its vulnerability and how open to pain and hurt we are when we feel it. So I think as he felt that pain vulnerability, he shut those defense mechanisms back and was getting a guided tour through them. When that happens, really all we have to do is surrender to the experience and just feel our feelings. We don't need a reason. We don't need to do anything. We just need to feel, oh my God, my dad really hurt me and he abandoned me and he was mean to me. And that is one of the big pains that has been keeping me away from just feeling my core. But oftentimes when we hurt, when we are feeling pain, we look for harm. We look for someone who has done something wrong or something that explains it. And as he was feeling those feelings, he projected onto me the father role. I'm the guy that enforces the rules, that helped him move, that does all the talking at retreat while I was working here. And I was a convenient receptacle for him to project these feelings onto. And so instead of sitting with those feelings, he threw them onto me and therefore escaped the process ayahuasca was trying to bring him through. So this brings us back to surrender. All we have to do is just let go, relax, and feel. The analogy I like for surrender is I think that ayahuasca is performing surgery on the soul, but we need to be our own anesthesia. We allow ourselves to feel whatever comes up, particularly the ones we don't like. Anger, suffering, physical discomfort, loneliness, despair. And we just become the container that feels, processes, and releases it. That's what catharsis is, and that's what ayahuasca is bringing us through. But when we fight it and escape, we miss what ayahuasca is offering us. The other analogy that I like is imagining working with ayahuasca like being in the middle of the ocean. If you're thrashing around and trying to swim and swim and swim, you're going to be exhausted and drown. If you just lay back, spread out your body, you'll float and eventually make it through. The main way we get away from surrendering is by overthinking, getting wrapped up in our mind, and over-controlling, trying to control our experience, trying to accomplish something, trying to get some certain thing, trying to figure out where we can be that'll make our experience better. And all of these are forms of action that insulate us from what ayahuasca is offering us. So a lot of the times, that's what we're talking about with putting the cat in the bath. We sabotage ourselves. Beautiful surrender is not just giving up, but it's giving in, flowing with the experience. So that's number 2, surrender. Number 3 is opening and acceptance. This is essentially expanding on that giving in piece. giving into the experience, opening to it, making it an active vow to not get or achieve anything, but to be open to what comes. The analogy I like to sort of visualize what this means is understanding that our kind of core, that inner essence that I was talking about, could be a base level of sediment. And ayahuasca is like pouring water down. There are other layers on top of that ayahuasca has to percolate through before we can connect to it. For some people, say they had a brutally traumatic childhood, they have done a bunch of drugs for decades and decades, they've never gone to therapy, they've never meditated, they've never worked with another plant medicine. The reality is that person might have concrete layers on top of that core sediment, very robust, rigid defense mechanisms that are protecting them. Ayahuasca may have to take a little bit more time to get through those cracks and touch that core sediment. Another person might have been really lucky and had very loving, caring, adept parents, a great childhood, done some therapy, worked with plant medicines, and they're more like big boulders, and the water just flows straight through and touches the core sediment. Most people are just kind of layers of sand of varying degrees of density. But what we can do in working with ayahuasca is trying to loosen up that sediment and open up to it. What this looks like is a deeper expression of surrender. It's not just giving in to what ayahuasca brings, it is actively being open to whatever could arrive. So that's being open to whatever emotions could come. That's being open to receiving to everything being given to you. It's an active vow of acceptance. There's a Zen phrase which is to go beyond prescriptions of good and bad. And I think that captures an element of what we're talking about with opening. You're going beyond what you want or what you don't want and just giving into being open to a pure experience of whatever comes. Even if you don't like it, you're open to it and you surrender to it. I think that's what pure experience is. Pure experience is when we've gone beyond what we want or what we don't want. What I think is left is simply the intensity of how we experience life. And at the end of the day, I think it's a real pleasure and gift to feel the whole spectrum of experience intensely and wholeheartedly. So that's number 3, opening. Number 4, finally, is listening. Listening is always being aware. The medicine, in some way, is always functioning. The question, though, is are we able to pay attention to it? The analogy for listening I like to use is the difference between a floodlight and a spotlight. A spotlight of awareness is when we are looking for one certain thing, waiting for it to arrive, and if anything else happens, we ignore it because it's not that thing. It is one specific light, and it's waiting for a fox to pass right in front of it. If a fox goes underneath or above, it is not acknowledged. Versus a floodlight is a wide, expansive light that illumines everything and pays attention to all that is in the surrounding. When I was here as a patient, I heard a number of people talk about talking to ayahuasca. One of the people actually explicitly identified that the way it worked for her was all of a sudden there was like a second voice in her head. And she was totally very rigidly atheistic, and she said that it was her subconscious gaining voice and talking to her kind of conscious internal monologue. Cool stuff. But she was having a conversation. When I heard that, I unknowingly developed a subconscious spotlight that assumed I was never talking to ayahuasca until a second voice entered into my mind and was talking with my inner monologue. And so I ignored everything else and assumed it wasn't talking to ayahuasca. But starting in my second ceremony, when I was connected, I would have these strong, kind of violent stomach convulsions. Only by my 4th ceremony did I recognize that those stomach convulsions were in direct communication with my internal monologue. I would think something, and there would be some intuitive answer coming from that jolt. It sounds both wacky, but also incredibly obvious. It's what they're talking about with listen to your gut. But because I had that mental framework developed and I wasn't aware of it, I missed it. And so listening is a very challenging, but incredibly important element of working with ayahuasca, but really I think living in general, of trying to be open to and listen to and receiving everything that's coming in, rather than just waiting for one specific thing to happen, rather than just like, oh, well, I didn't have vision, so I didn't have anything. As I said, ayahuasca works on such diverse, high levels that everything is important. Ayahuasca can be a deep body cleansing. It can be love, subtle insights, quiet messages, the bubbling of memories, anger, frustration, joy, love, peace. Everything is important. And so try to relax, go inwards, go into that trance state, and just be aware of it. Another Zen phrase I think is great for this one, listening, is the idea of stepping back into your fundamental awareness. There's the thinking mind we have, and then there's awareness of all the things that we're feeling and thinking. And being able to step into that place is a really helpful way to work with ayahuasca. So there you go. Those are the 5 skills I think are very important to keep in mind as ways that will help you harmonize with and benefit from ayahuasca, working in union with it rather than against it. To summarize, the overarching category is flow, and then there's trust, surrender, listening, and opening. And just kind of wrap it up in a nice little sandwich, I think the last thing that all of those skills require is a lot of courage. So being courageous is important with ayahuasca too. To surrender to something we don't yet know and don't understand or even trust, that takes courage. To surrender to something new and unknown, to trust something new and unknown, both of those take a lot of courage. To be open, that takes so much courage. We spend our whole life closed off to protect ourselves. That takes courage. To listen, that involves the courage of not thinking that we know what's going to happen, of stepping back into a not knowing and just allowing whatever comes to come. Ayahuasca asks for bravery. It asks for us to set our souls aflame so that we can live with all of our life force and feel that within ceremony. That is hard and scary, but all of us have it inside of us and all of us can do it.